Ours is a violent world. It's often said that we live in a violent society. It's true as we look over the world today, as an ancient writer said about the world in his day, the world is filled with violence. I believe that religion is the citadel of human violence. And in this session we're going to explore the relationship that exists between religion and violence, just as in the last session we looked at the relationship between religion and guilt. Religion is a human enterprise. Homo sapiens is Homo religiosus. Ancient and modern human beings are religious creatures, and they always indulge in this enterprise of religion, dividing the whole order of reality between the sacred and the secular, using the sacred as a means of relating to God, either using the sacred as a means of getting near to God, although mostly that's a pretense. Human beings usually use the religion as a method of keeping God off, pretending to get near to God. It is really a method of keeping God off. Religion, while it's used as this mediating factor to relate to the divine, and we dealt with that in the last issue of Verdict, I want to talk about religion, how it relates on the human level as the legitimizer of the human order. We need order and stability. We cannot live without a sense of meaning, and so our society, in order to justify or legitimize the social and political order, human beings, it seems, always turn to religion. There's a lot of very fine books written on the sociology of religion, the function that religion plays in society. I can't go into it all. Excellent books. The function that religion plays in America, for instance, to legitimize the American way of life, to legitimize our war against the great evil of communism, to legitimize the American foreign policy, and many other things. From ancient times to modern times, religion is a human enterprise. It is the legitimizer of the social and the political order. When we look at the state, or is it politics, it is based upon a sort of legalized violence. No state exists, for instance, just by recommending the good life, commending it to its citizens. They have to be constrained to obey, so it has to rest on force. Inside there is the police, and for outside there is the military. So society exists with the police force inside and the military force for the outside in order to retain its integrity. Both in modern times or ancient times as well as modern times, religion plays a vital role in legitimizing both the social and the political order. It was no different in ancient Israel either, for that matter, because ancient Israel existed as a kind of theocracy where church and state were united. It was founded on a constitution that demanded a type of justice that might be characterised by what is stated in the law of Moses: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now this sanctioned a sort of a payback kind of justice. And it was an advance on some of it was a great advance on some of the rank injustices of the ancient world, where justice wasn't returned, maybe 2 eyes for 1 eye, or 10 lives for 1 life. The law of Moses at least restrains this element of revenge and puts a limit on it of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But nevertheless does sanctify, does legitimise the principle of paying back. And this is expressed in many ways in the Old Testament, and especially in its religion of atonement, because if you get to the root idea of atonement, as the idea comes to be mediated in the Old Testament, the idea of atonement is to make amends by paying back. If God is angry, he can only, and he's angry with Israel, he's angry because of Israel's sins, he can only be propitiated by paying him back. The debt has to be paid. For instance, in the Old Testament, we have that gruesome story of, because of the wrong that Israel had committed toward the Gibeonites, God was angry with Israel, and people started dying, on the right hand, on the left. The plague was killing thousands. And they rushed around wondering what they could do to stop the plague, and then they understood what was wrong, why God was angry, because of the wrong that they had done to the Gibeonites some years before. And so what they did is took the sons of Saul, whatever the sons of Saul had with it, I don't know, but they took the sons of Saul and they slew them and they hanged them up, and there was that poor woman, she was trying to get the bodies down before the birds would eat them. And when the sons of Saul were slain, then the anger of the Lord was pacified. He stopped killing off the Israelites. Now mostly, and very fortunately, they offered animal sacrifices. But sometimes, and there's some scriptures that speak of bloodletting, the paying back was done by means of animals, but sometimes the bloodletting was done with human beings, as in the case of Saul. The killing of the sons of Saul made an atonement. And sometimes the bloodletting was done among the heathen. There's some very, very gruesome passages about the slaughter of the heathen and how it's going to be a sacrifice to the Lord. Of course, the heathen had the same idea, and they thought bloodletting among the Israelites was going to appease their gods. But religion legitimised violence. Even the religion, which was the highest religion, even the religion of the Old Testament legitimises violence. When the Israelites were settling the land of Canaan, they had to drive out the indigenous people out of Palestine, take their place, root them out. Sometimes they were engaged in a whole program of genocide. Women, children, they slaughtered the lot. This was religiously, you can place your own value on it, but for But the fact remains, it was not an ordinary war. They didn't look upon the war as a dirty business. The war was sacralized. It was made a holy war. It was a sacred duty. So the violence, and you can't avoid the fact that violence was perpetrated against an indigenous people, the violence was sacralized and therefore made legitimate. As history rolled on, of course in the early history of Israel, when they overcame their enemies and were able to drive out the people of Palestine and so on and overcome the Canaanites, and you read the early stories, is because they regarded their God, Yahweh, was stronger than the God of the Canaanites and the Philistines. There was a contest, as war was against war, whose God was the strongest. And so Israel's faith was sort of bolstered and their confidence was bolstered as they overcame their enemies. But as history rolled on, then you have the rise of the great power, Babylon, Assyria, and then Babylon, and then the great Persian Empire, and the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire, which subjugated Israel, persecuted them, oppressed them, killed them. Now, how could they explain all that? How come their God was so weak? How come God now wasn't like the good old days, overcoming their enemies? How come the enemies, the great power, was so much stronger than Israel? They needed a whole new rationale now in order to explain all this. And it reached its height in that body of literature in between the testamental period, which we call Jewish apocalyptic. Now, Jewish apocalyptic looked off to the future and saw that while Israel is being oppressed and Israel suffers now, and maybe a lot of this is because of Israel's sins, one day the God of Israel will stand up and there he will render his divine justice and he will pay back the heathen tit for tat and he'll overthrow them mightily in that day and he'll rescue Israel. And there's no doubt about it. A lot of that literature in Jewish apocalyptic is downright, it's vindictiveness, it breathes the spirit of revenge and the desire, the longing that the God of Israel would come forth with this super display of divine violence. You see, God in all this is regarded as the God of the superstate. Down here on this earth, there's the state. There's the social and political order down here. And Israel down here with its society and its state, its system, it has its constitution, it has the law of Moses, the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And above this, they conceive of God presiding over the superstate, and they long for the end time. They long for the last days when at last God will appear, and they pray for the coming of the kingdom of God, and it will be a day of wrath and a day of tremendous vengeance upon all the enemies of Israel, and they will utterly perish, and their flesh will be like dung on the earth, scattered from one end of the earth to the other. And so God was conceived of one who presided over this sort of super state. And they longed for this day. And there came a time when there was a great air of expectancy in the land. As Luke records, all men were in expectation that Israel had suffered this violence long enough, and God was to reveal the divine violence that they were waiting for. They were waiting for this show called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And then justice would be done. Score would be settled. They developed a theology of books, where God had books. and every wrong done and every justice that was practiced against Israel. He kept the score of wrongs. When the kingdom of God dawned, they would realize it. Stroke for stroke and injustice for justice, God would pay back all the damage done to Israel. And then the irony of it all is that a man appeared on the scene proclaiming a new kind of justice that so disturbed them, that was so a threat to their religious hopes, that they were waiting for this true Messiah to come. You see, it was like people sitting in a big show. They were waiting for the show to get, the show to get on. See? Use your imagination. They're waiting for this important person to arrive and bring the kingdom of God. And they were waiting, what? They'd been waiting for centuries for this thing. They could hardly wait for the show to get started. They wanted to see these sinners frying, these sinners. Sinners in the hand of an angry God was the name of the show that they were waiting to see. They couldn't wait any longer. But this man who came on the scene, this phony Messiah, if they tolerated him, well, bless you, that somehow he was going to interrupt the show. He would even delay it. There was a danger that he would postpone it. They had to get him off the stage. He was a nuisance, an embarrassment. Get rid of him. In fact, because of his challenge, they took him and they dealt with him with violence, and the same violence, or rather the same appeal that justified the violence of old and the violence of Jewish apocalyptic, they justified in the execution of Jesus. In fact, for them, the execution of Jesus wasn't some sort of misdemeanor, some dirty, unfortunate work that they had to participate in. The execution of Jesus was something demanded of them in order for them to be faithful to God. And so they appealed to their scriptures and to their law to justify the violence against this phony Messiah. But we believe that this life was uniquely related to God. That God himself, whom they had waiting for, this God of super violence to appear, this God that the Jews professed to worship, this God was uniquely identified with this life of this oppressed, suffering man who was taken out and executed with all the riffraff, because no person of high birth was ever crucified and executed on a tree. This person who was the oppressed and judged the curse of the earth, we believe that God identified him in such a way that the tables are turned, and amazingly turned, that what really happens here in the drama of the death of Jesus is not the drama of sinners in the hands of an angry God that they sort of tried to act out in the execution. Here was a sinner. We will show what divine wrath will do with this sinner. And they acted out what they believed was divine justice. But the resurrection shows us what was really taking place was the drama of a crucified God in the hands of angry sinners. Now, they could have been warned, of course, in the Old Testament that God was one who identified with the oppressed. After all, he'd released Egypt, a race of slaves. that God was on the side of the fatherless, that God was on the side of the widow, that he takes pity on the weak and those who have no strength. They might have been warned of that, but who could have been prepared for this surprise? That God is so identified with such that he would so fully identify with the most oppressed and sinful and accursed of the earth. Now, the amazing thing is this: when we think of this story of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, first, how that by his resurrection, this life triumphed over death, because this life was indestructible. That's what he said. That was the faith of Jesus. Life, this kind of life that lives in God and God lives in it, life is indestructible. It's like the law of physics that even boys and girls learn it at school. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. You cannot produce that life. You can't get it from an ism. You can't get it from religion. It's a gift. It can only be kindled by the life itself. Man cannot create it by any devising, and man cannot destroy it. That is the light of the resurrection. And here you have in the resurrection the triumph of this life over all the violence of men, the violence of religion, that he leaves those things exposed and empty and powerless. But here is the amazing thing. Christianity comes on the scene. Instead of seeing what the death and resurrection of Jesus really is, I want to suggest it fundamentally misrepresents what really takes place, and then adds to the picture that somehow, see, the Jews believe that the cross is an exhibition of divine violence, of God's anger against evil, don't they? Of course the Jew does. Here's an evil man. Look at the blasphemy he's committed. Look what the law demands. And so in the authority of religion, they rise up and they say the death of Jesus is an exhibition of divine violence. Christianity comes along and says, yes, that's right. The cross is an exhibition of divine violence, but far greater than any of that. The sufferings of Christ and the agonies of Christ are beyond him, beyond computation, and what's really happening in the cross is an exhibition of divine violence, where God, who demands that the books be met and all the sins that have been written in the book, that there has to be an eye and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a God who demands that the scales of justice must be equal, somehow takes his Son and punishes him there with an infinite punishment on behalf of sinners, so that on that basis he now may forgive. And so we're exhorted very often to contemplate and think about the Garden of Gethsemane and the tremendous suffering, and contemplate the wounds, and to contemplate this suffering, and to contemplate this blood, to make you feel sufficiently guilty and sorry that this drama, or rather this violence, that this Old Testamental situation, rather this violence that the Jews believed in, has actually been taken up and perfected in the Christian religion. In our next session, I want to continue with this, and I want to show we must understand why Christianity, throughout its history, there's no doubt about it, has become the most violent religion. It is responsible for shedding more blood in the history of all the religions of this world, that this is no sort of aberration. Violence is inherent to the Christian religion. We want to bring it right down to our time and show it is an issue. This sacralisation of violence in this world today is an issue that might well decide whether this world will survive to see the 21st century. Thank you.